Today we will be studying a very important topic. I think actually this is the major theme that I've been working on for the past number of years, both in the field of spiritual theology and mission theology. And the book that I finalized basically is dealing with this whole topic. This is what we may call in theological language theological anthropology. And I will not be specific about this, but actually it's more than theological anthropology. I think it's more Christological anthropology. But I will not talk about that because this is the Old Testament, and you know that the Bible is progressive in its revelation. It doesn't give us everything, you know. It does make it so evident and obvious from the start. We have to read through the Bible before we come to a progressive sense of understanding. And finally, when we get to the New Testament, we see that with the incarnation of Jesus Christ, we see, the light shining forth and blasting this revelatory insight and transforming our hearts even more. So, I've titled the message for today, Humans as Image of God. And we're going to look at a portion of chapter 1 of Genesis, verses 26 to 28. Let's read this out loud together. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Amen. Now, the evolutionists, those who really believe that everything can be explained by this theory of evolution, and to a point that you can write God out of the picture, write him off, and eliminate the God factor. And they claim that they can still explain how the world is run, how things happen, how all that we see in terms of nature and humanity and the earthly habitat and all can be explained without God through the theory of evolution. And one of their favorite premise is that human beings are no different from animals. Because they want to postulate that everything ultimately can evolve into everything else. And so humans are just a few steps ahead of the animals, and even amongst the primate species, that human beings are not that extraordinary as sometimes the Christians make them out to be. Have you heard that notion? Mm-hmm. And you know that us Christians, for us, human beings are of great dignity and great value. But for the evolutionists in general, they're no different from animals. And so the irony is that even regarding the issue of abortion, the child in the womb, we may call that child a person, but they might simply regard the child as just organism, bunch of tissues, cells, a composite of something which may not be labeled as person from their evolutionistic perspective. Okay? And so they have no problems aborting that child in the womb. Okay? And because they see no difference between that child and an animal, infant, in terms of the whole developmental process. And so I want to argue against that based upon chapter 1 of Genesis, that human beings are created with such uniqueness and such dignity that we are very, very much to be set apart from rest of the kingdoms, whether it be of the material kingdom or the kingdom of vegetation or the kingdom of animals. Human beings really stand out. Now, mind you, I believe that human beings, we overlap with the material kingdom, no doubt about that. We are materials, we are chemical compositions, right? And of course, we overlap with vegetation, simply because even the vegetables, trees and plants, they have life. So we do share commonality. They have cells, they grow. And we, of course, share a lot in common with animals. To a point that scientists are saying that we share, in terms of genetic elements, compared to chimpanzee, we share something like 98 point some percent likeness. But you see, the question is not the similarity, it's the difference. It's that minute, small percentage of difference between chimpanzees and humans that makes all the difference. And what is that? Well, let's discover that based upon the text today. Okay? And we have read through the chapter 1 a number of times, and now we have a sense of pattern, a sense of flow, sense of emphasis and repetition. So I think that's a good background for us to talk about the very uniqueness of human beings. First of all, Moses and whoever compiled this book, along with the rest of the Pentateuch, clearly had the human being as the focus and the highlight of the story here. Why? Because the human beings were the final of all creation. Now just think about it. If you're going to make something, make anything, an artwork or cook food or do whatever, would you put the most important thing, most essential thing right there at the very beginning, or usually hold on to the very end before you really put that element into that artwork? What did you do? Just think about it. I think there's something to this. I'm not trying to state a law, but I think I have noticed that we usually tend to save the very best for the last, do we not? People do that when they're dating too, right? You date around, and let's say you have many options of the potential suitors, right? And
that's a good example.
And just listen to me to the end. And you don't just want to, sometimes you don't really know how to go about in terms of sequence of meeting people. So you usually just meet people in general, and then you save yourself for the very best at the end.
그렇게 데이트 안 했는데.
그렇게 안 했어요? 그렇게.
그렇게 옵션이 많은 사람.
option. Okay. Maybe I should get rid of that
don't think that's
illustration.
a-
Okay.
appropriate
It just kind of sparked in my head. But okay, I'll get rid of that.
Yes.
But can you think of any illustration that substantiates this premise that the very best, the highlight of everything should be saved for the last? Well, let me try another
That's
illustration.
how Anna eats.
Huh? Yeah, I know. I've noticed that some kids, save the very best
yeah.
to
So
the
I'll
end.
ask, oh, you're not
Learn
gonna
to-
eat that?
Yeah.
And she goes, no, I love this. I'm gonna eat
Yeah,
it.
eat less. And so I've noticed that she does that. She saves that until the end, and then she really wants to savor that taste, right? What about in performance? You know, like usually in some kind of concert, they have those people, right, or whatever concert it may be, they have other preliminary performers, right? And then the final star appears on stage and performs, right? Okay. That happens all the time. Okay. And the books as well. We may write great books, but at the end, if the conclusion doesn't really wrap things up, then you know it kind of loses the steam. So if we look at this story, we see clearly that the creation of the human being is reserved for the last. And there's all this emphasis about human beings that is missing when it has to do with creating of the elements, creating of the materials, creating of vegetations, creating of animal kingdom. So we see that when God created the universe, He created a material world, then He created a plant kingdom, then the animal kingdom, and finally, within that animal kingdom, God invests in creating human beings. And the picture that I get is almost like, okay, if the human beings belong to the family of God, and that's what God is trying to create. He's trying to create a family, isn't it? He's trying to create His own people, His own community. Well then, if He's going to create human beings, then He's got to create some kind of habitat for the human beings to live in, right? And when we have children, we are envisioning that someday our children are going to get married, and hopefully if we have money, we can provide for them, and even provide an apartment or housing, right? So it seems like God creates this kind of environmental habitat with all these wonderful, wonderful elements. And then finally He creates human beings to live and dwell in that habitat. We see more of that pronounced in chapter 2. And chapter 2 is very intimate about the Garden of Eden, sort of like a paradise into which the human beings enter for dwelling. And so we know that human beings are unique because they were created in the final round of creation. And second of all, when they were created, according to the text, it uses a very personal expression. God says, let us make. Let us make. It's very different from let there be. Let there be is, in a way, kind of impersonal, you might say. God just speaks the word and let things happen. But here He says, no, let us make. He's personalizing that. But have you noticed here the plurality of it? Why does it say, let us make, when God is one? And we are monotheists. We believe that God is one. There are not two, three gods. God is one. But how could He speak in plurality? And so scholars have different interpretations of this. Some say that this is perhaps referring to the heavenly court, the context in which He's speaking. He's speaking to the angels. He's saying, we. But it's odd that He would say, we made it, when only God can make and God can create. And some will use this expression in a particular sense, and that is known as plurality of majesty. It's like Elohim. That's plural too, and that's the term for God. You know, and that plurality is that of majesty, you know, that magnifies the greatness and awesome nature of God. But I've also read some commentaries in which they talk about this as potentially pointing to the very nature of God being Trinitarian. That God is Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. 3 persons in one. And I talk about that a little later. But it's something very personal. And so here it says, the narrative clearly shows that God speaks to himself, or speaks within his triune community of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And then he creates the humans, and then he blesses them, and then he speaks to the humans. He gives a mandate. In verse 28, God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." This is very unique. We don't see God operating this way in regards to any other elements of his creation. But here he singles out the human beings when he says, "We will make." And then he speaks into them. And of course he blesses them. Another thing that makes human beings unique is that human beings are created according to the very image of God. Remember the plants and the animals, they were created according to their kinds, right? Do you remember that? And that's how it is described in the narrative, that they are created according to their kinds. But regarding human beings, God says, no, I am going to create them according to my kind, or my very image. And so we see this term, this concept of image being repeated 3 times here. So, here, look at this. Let's look at the reading here in verse 26. Then God says, "Let us make mankind in our image." And then in verse 27, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. 3 times in these 2 verses, God talks about human beings made in his own image. So we have to talk about this. What does it mean to be the image of God? What does it mean to bear the image of God? And in that sense, we are very, very unique. You know, Old Testament scholars would say that human beings are unique, even more unique than the angels, because do angels really bear the image of God? They come closest to God. But these scholars would say, no, the human beings are even closer to God for a number of reasons. And we're going to come to discover that more and more. Another distinction that we see here is that when God created human beings, he created them male and female. In verse 27, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. There's this gender differentiation here. But there's none of this kind of gender mentioning regarding the animals, are there? It seems like animals simply belong to just the chain of all this creation, and they're distinguished from every other type. So the plants and the trees is one category. The fishes of the sea, the birds of the sky, the land animals, these are all categorically different. But in terms of human beings, the description is not so much that they are different from other entities, but rather the differentiation is within. The whole human race is divided as male and female, but at the same time, that male and female is within that mankind. So the irony is that man, human, is a singular. Okay? You know, the term is Adam, right? Adam is singular, right? But this singularity has two aspects, the maleness and the femaleness. And so this whole issue of gender is a very important thing. And you know that today in our society, there's this sort of gender war or gender conflict. That is one of the major issues. And they basically fractured this notion. And now it's all fragmented into a dozen, 2 dozens of gender types. And I'm not trying to make an issue of that right now, but what I'm trying to say is when God created male and female, I think there is an issue to that. There is going to be a very important theme, and we need to come to terms with that. Or our children, our descendants are going to be confused for the rest of their lives. And they will be torn and shattered and disillusioned. And I ache over that, and I want to learn about that more. I really want to learn about this whole spectrum of gender, you know. I want to learn. I don't want to waste my time, but this is not a waste of time. I have to really understand in order to empathize.
If you can,
You know?
if you can resolve this,
Yeah.
you'll help so many.
I don't think we'll ever be able to completely resolve it, but at least we can have empathy of the struggle that they're going through.
그 empathy도 그렇고 그래도 조금 이렇게 if you can develop this writing, it would help
I think
Christians articulate.
yeah. I think that's one of the things that I really want to do, because this is not something, it comes up over and over.
It's
You know,
huge.
in our discussions, and you know, Korean church is very silent about this.
Right.
Even the theologians at my school and other places, they don't know how to deal with this,
Exactly. Yeah.
because they think trying to even discuss this is turning liberal. But I'm saying that we have to kind of turn liberal, because this is a very important issue that's really dividing
Yes.
human society and dividing the churches and the denominations. So we also need to talk about this thing called maleness and femaleness. What do we learn from this? What is God saying to us about this? Why is this so important? And another thing that distinguishes human beings is that they were created with this great sense of authority and responsibility. Look at the mandate that was given to them. God plans that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God commands or mandates the human beings to fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. So the human beings are basically to function as the rulers of earth. Of course, God is the ultimate ruler, but human beings are the delegated rulers. And we are given the responsibility to rule and govern the earth. We must not shirk from that responsibility. Now, of course, when we use the term like rule and govern, that's an authoritative concept. And so we think that it necessarily translates as oppression and exploitation. And of course, human beings have been guilty of exploiting nature, exploiting animal kingdom, and the plant kingdom, and so forth. But the real intent of God is that human beings are to actually care for and provide for nature. That we are to be the stewards of the natural resources. We need to be held accountable to God as His servant stewards. Okay. So we have a lot of things that we can talk about in terms of this kind of stewardship type of leadership, that mandate that is given to us. And then finally, the human beings are explained even further, are there expounded upon in the following chapter. In chapter 2, it focuses on human beings. And of course, the rest of the Bible is all about human beings. Not to neglect the nature or the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom, but it seems like the human beings are the main characters in this whole series of scenarios that will follow. But the difference between chapter 1 and chapter 2, we'll talk about this later, but it's basically that chapter 1 is written in more of the epic style, in the third person. That is, God said, it says that God did this and this and this. But when we get to here, God says, let us. Okay? He's talking to himself. And then he's talking to human beings. So in first person, second person, it becomes more personal. So chapter 1 is basically epic style in the third person. And as I mentioned earlier, it is written in more of the myth type narrative style, even though it is true myth. I believe that it is true myth. But it is written in a myth style writing. But chapter 2 is written in more lyrical style, that is in the first and the second person, in more of the intimate and personalized style. And it becomes really intimate because when we get to chapter 2, it describes the making of the human beings as though God is like a potter forming the clay and forming the figure of a human being. Then he breathes into this human, and this human becomes a living creature. And then he takes a rib out of this one creature, and then he makes a partner for him, and all that. It becomes much more personalized. Okay, so do you have any questions about human uniqueness? I hope you have not bought into this notion that is advocated by the evolutionists, saying that humans are nothing special at all. They downplay the uniqueness of humanity. Or am I the only one who's reading that and reading that over and over to a point that I'm getting really fired up about this issue? We are unique. But that is not to place us in the position of some kind of elitistic status. That's not what we're talking about. We are unique, but with that uniqueness, with that privilege, we are to serve the lower kingdoms. We're to serve all that has been handed to us, that we are to be accountable for. Okay, now I want to talk about the whole theme of human dignity. And in order to really understand this notion of human dignity, we need to understand this concept of image of God. What is image of God? How are we the image of God? What does it mean to be created in God's image? And scholars for past 2,000 years have actually talked about this issue. Church fathers, the theologians, reformers, the theologians. In the past 2 millennia, they have been discussing this. It is one of the major topics in the theological circles. And they even have a Latin term for that, imago Dei. The whole concept of human beings being created according to the image of God. So when we talk about theological anthropology, we're basically talking about imago Dei. And there are basically 3 interpretations. And I just want you to know that. And this is not a fancy thing I'm trying to give you. This is a common thing that most biblical scholars pretty much know, that these are the major interpretations. Okay? First interpretation is what is known as the substantial or structuralist interpretation. And that is basically that human beings are structurally and compositionally made up of those elements which are in the likeness of God. That there's something substantial inside of me, you, and all human beings that is very much like God. And just to give you a short summary of that, we're talking about the intellectual capacity, emotional capacity, spiritual capacity, the volitional capacity, the moral capacity, the creative attribute, the linguistic attribute, the social dimension, and even the ability to administer and to govern. All these are very much specially endowed attributes of being a human, because these have to do with the attributes of God. But the irony is this: most of these scholars would talk about all these elements, but they would somehow leave the body out of the picture. And I think you can understand why they would leave the body out of the picture, right? And because that's the way I've been teaching for years. Oh, we are very much like God, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually, morally. We are creative like God and so forth. But somehow we leave the body out of the picture. And I want to bring the body back into the picture. Because if you really understand more in depth about this concept of the image of God, then you cannot leave the body out of the picture. Second interpretation is that of relational view. That human beings are relational, human beings are social. And of course, theologians like Karl Barth and Brunner and even Bonhoeffer, they took this Genesis text and that phrase, let us, that plurality in divinity, as implying something Trinitarian, and then apply this to human beings, because human beings have been created as male and female. So this would create a sort of opposition for what Barth would say confrontation, or what most theologians would say encounter between fellows, that causes what is known as I-thou relationship. So they would interpret this in a relational way. But I like John Calvin's interpretation that the image of God, it can be understood with the analogy of a mirror. It's sort of like a reflection. We are not God, but we are the sort of reflection of God. So whichever angle you are at, you will see certain reflections of God, certain aspects of God. And so he would explain it this way in a relational sense. But I do have to say that the Old Testament scholars are pretty much biased towards the third interpretation. And the third interpretation is known as the representative view. That the image is not so much inherent in our being, but image has to do with the function of a human being. And it is based upon the fact that the human beings are given this great authority and great privilege to rule over rest of the creation, that we are basically called to be the representatives of God. And there's this notion in the ancient Near Eastern tradition, and I mentioned this over and over in some of my sermons and teachings, that this ancient Near Eastern notion is that a king or a pharaoh would actually represent God to this world. So just think about this. Here we can say that there's a sort of an evolution of thought. You start with this notion like you cannot see God, so you create an idol, right? Made out of wood, stone, or some kind of metal, and you worship God. Say, this is God. But this is actually a symbol of God, but it is not God, because God cannot be contained in the material things like that. Okay? But better yet, it evolves into actually a human being representing God, like a king or a pharaoh, or like in North Korea, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un, these figures who are deified, and they represent God. And so they would be God who is living and breathing and moving and acting and speaking. How convenient is that? So what the Genesis author is saying is this: what has been attributed to only those privileged kings and pharaohs, now it is endowed unto all humanity, that all human beings are like kings and pharaohs. And so there's this kind of a universalization or democratization of this view of Imago Dei, which used to be monopolized by the pharaohs and kings. Now we are all pharaohs and kings. We are all kings in the kingdom. We are all images of God. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Okay. So again, I'm not making this up. This is something that if you read any theology book and get to the chapter on theological anthropology, and especially read about the concept of Imago Dei, you will come to the similar conclusion that I have come to. Okay. So in order for us to really operate as the image of God, in the sense that we reflect God to others, that we represent God to others, that we are like God to others, because God cannot be seen. God is unreal to others, but we are real to others. And so God would use us to represent Him. God will use us so that we may speak on His behalf, that we may relay His heart, that we may relay His actions. And because we are created to represent God as the image of God, the body is a crucial thing. The body is the most important thing here. If we are simply ghosts, we cannot represent God. Right? If we're just souls, we cannot represent God. But we are essentially ensouled body or embodied souls. And therefore, we can concretely represent God. But it's not just being a bodily entity. We have to be moving and enacting. That's the important thing. There has to be action, there has to be movement. And so the second element is that of agency. That is so crucial. Because we not only have a body, we have the body which can move, which can intentionally act towards something, and thereby we represent God. And how do we go about doing this? We do it through sense perception. And this is an area that I've been researching. I also wrote a thesis on this. If you want a copy of that, I'd be glad to give you. But this whole way of human operation is all by sense perception. This is how we perceive what is outside of us. And we also express ourselves, articulate ourselves through these means. And what are these means? Well, first of all, I would say that the first type of sense is what is categorized as soma kinesthetic sense. I don't know whether you've heard of this concept, but soma means body, kinesthetic means action or movement. So it is bodily movement senses. We have all kinds of senses. We start with the 5 senses of seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, right? We operate with it, but our bodies are filled with sensors. Everything is sense. So we perceive the world through these senses, and also we are sensitized toward the world because of these abilities. But we have more than soma kinesthetic senses. We have aesthetic senses, We have moral sense, we got communal sense, we got spiritual sense, we got all kinds of senses with which we operate. And so basically, the conclusion statement that I want to make is this. We have all these capabilities, abilities with which we can interact with the world. And so the question that I have for you is this. What are we doing about it? What are we doing with all these senses, with all these capabilities, all these endowments that God has granted unto us? You see, He made us in this way so that we can manifest Him in the most concrete way. But if we are simply ghosts, if we're simply souls, if we are simply excarnated beings instead of incarnated beings, then we can't operate this way. And so the implication is this. If we're going to talk about Christian life and Christian spirituality, you can't just talk about souls. I know we use the term spiritual life, but that's not what it means, as a lot of people presume that it to be. Spiritual life is not just the life of our spirit. Spiritual life is actually our entire being that is embodied, that is being led by the Spirit of God. That's what it means. You know, a lot of people think the word spiritual there is talking about human spirit. And I know that's important, but what about human body? What about all the other attributes of humans? The rational, emotional dimensions. You see, that spiritual is not referring to us. It's talking about being led by the Spirit of God. And so as a whole being, we are led by the Spirit of God to manifest Christ-likeness in this world. Amen.
Amen.
Now, I understand this is it can sound very complex. And I have to say, human beings are really complex. We're not just simple thing like a piece of rock, a piece of wood. We are very complex beings. And yet the beauty is that all the complexity integrated into one, that we can function in the likeness of Christ. And so the challenge that lies before us is, so we have all these parts and aspects, all these mechanisms, all these dynamics, and they have to all kind of have to be integrated, have to come together to be a working model. And where do we see that? I see that in Jesus Christ, in the Gospels. When I read the Gospels, I see this perfect integration, representing God, being the image of God, and that is none other than Jesus Christ. So in the New Testament, it refers to Jesus Christ as the image of God, as the prototype of the image of God. So that's why we use the term imago Christi. That basically, if we want to really recover the sense of image of God, we got to go to Christ, who exemplified that, who modeled that for us. And simply put, if we really attain the sense of imago Christi, then we've attained everything that God originally meant us to be. Amen. I could tell that my wife is kind of puzzled by all these complexities surrounding this simple talk about human beings. But I cannot help but to relay this idea or notion that it is very complicated. You can't talk about it in one setting. We should take an entire year to talk about Imago Dei. But once you understand what Imago Dei is, it will revolutionize your thinking. Let me give you a short testimony. I pursued my Christian walk with theological studies. And right after I got born again, a year later, I went to seminary and started studying theology. And I was fascinated by that. And I've studied theology since. It's been 40 years of studying in depth, all kinds of theological topics and themes. And I thought it was all about theology, just know God and know God's nature, know about His kingdom nature. And I didn't really bother to think about myself or how human beings are created. I thought anthropology was secondary, not primary. But guess what? In the past 10 years, I've been studying anthropology. Of course, as mission theologian, I have to study anthropology, but it's not simply because of that. I realized I cannot just know God and not know myself. As Calvin says, everything about wisdom and true assurance and true faith is that of knowing God, knowing ourselves. It's got to be two. It's got to be both. And so I would like to suggest that you invest in this study and meditation for at least one good year. Not just meditate on God, but meditate on yourself and meditate on human beings that we see around us. Look at our children, ask this question, who are they? In nature, who are they? And I saw Anna growing up, and she's my final chance to really explore in depth and observe in depth. And I've been watching Anna grow up, and I'm fascinated by how a human being develops. I didn't bother to examine that because I was too busy trying to grow up and try to develop myself. I never bothered to examine myself. But through Anna, I began to really observe. That's why it was past 10 years or so of my observation of Anna growing up and then realizing, wow, it's beautiful, it's fascinating how God created human beings, that little child, that little infant, that fetus, that embryo in Esther's womb emerges into this world and grows and develops. And I'm looking forward to how many more years God will give me to observe that, and observe my children, observe people in general. And I go back to this Genesis text over and over again. God created human beings so well, in a so profound way, in such a wonderful and dynamic way. And we need to start exploring that. So a lot of the books that I've been reading in the past 10 years is all in this section. It's all about anthropology. And I'm now very fascinated about culture as well, because you cannot talk about human beings unless you talk immediately about the surroundings of all the manifestations that human beings engage in. That's what we call culture. And I cannot help to talk next about arts, because culture that is developed beyond the survival level is all art. And after we talk about eating and drinking and protecting ourselves and surviving the hostile environment, then we develop everything into art. And that's how God created us to be. It's again very fascinating to just think about human value, human dignity. And I believe that this is the key to us educating our children and us educating the next generation. We have to teach them what being human is all about. And the schools don't do that. The schools are not even teaching ethics. That used to be a major curriculum. Even in American education, they're taking ethics out of the school now. We got to bring all these elements back. We got to bring humanities courses back into theological curriculum. I think I've said enough, so I've just kind of thrown a lot at you. I hope that you're not thinking, okay, that's the professor in Daniel that's coming out. No, I don't mean to be a professor here. I'm just, maybe I don't know how to articulate well. I'm sure there are people who can articulate this kind of concepts so much better than me. But I'm just trying to communicate to you that this is so important, so crucial. And that's why I started this Genesis prologue study, because of this theme of Imago Dei in the first place. I don't know if you know that.